Hello and welcome back to Botcrim. I'm Tim Jaggs, I'm Botcrim's founder. In this video I'm going to talk about how we're going to break the cycle of ever-rising sexual abuse and sexual abuse costs by converting what amounts to a statement of intent, the safe environment, into a story of conscientious protection by organisations looking after minors and vulnerable adults. As always, I try and give you a quick 2-minute version of the video. Broadly speaking, a safe environment is a statement of intent. We're going to maintain a safe environment around your kids. Statements of intent have their place, but they're not enough on their own. They don't mean very much until they're backed up by a systematic process that ensures that the statement of intent is actually delivered. Risk management best practices is how the intent is delivered. It's how you get the job done. And when it's done well and when it's recorded appropriately, it tells a story of an organisation having conscientiously protected minors and vulnerable adults. And when the organisation can tell a story of how they have conscientiously protected minors and vulnerable adults, they also get to protect themselves. That's how they protect themselves. You can't protect yourselves in any other way than that you do as good a job as you can at protecting children in the first place, and that you record that you've done that. That's how we're going to break the cycle. That's how we're going to make it much less likely that sexual abuse will happen, and that if it does, bearing in mind no prevention mechanism is ever foolproof, and the costs of failing to prevent sexual abuse have become so significant you couldn't assume that your prevention mechanism was going to work, and so you need to have a mechanism in place to protect yourself as a youth-serving organisation from the consequences of failing to prevent sexual abuse. So in other words, it addresses all of the different costs. That's the 2-minute version. You don't need to, basically, if you take away from this that the way we're going to convert a statement of intent into a story of conscientious protection is by supplementing a safe environment with risk management best practices. You've got what this video is all about. I'm now going to slow things down a bit, and I'm going to go into some of the details about how that story gets told, because that's the crux of all of this. How do you make sure that the story conveys how you have conscientiously protected minors and vulnerable adults from sexual abuse? So here goes. The story is made up of 3 parts, as risk management best practice is made up of 3 parts. The first stage of risk management best practice is to assess your risk. In terms of the story, what that means is that you're saying to yourselves and to anybody else that wants to see it, this is how we want to help minors and vulnerable adults. And because of that objective, let me come back to that. But because of that objective, here is where we believe minors and vulnerable adults are potentially vulnerable to sexual abuse. The point is, if you think about taking risk, what is a risk? Let's look at it with an example that pretty much everybody will recognise. You're in one job and you're thinking about applying for another job. It might be in the same organisation, it might be somewhere else, it doesn't matter. It's a new job. And there is a risk to trying to go for a new job. You might not get the job. You might be found out applying for it and lose the job you're in at the moment, or have some other negative consequence. There are also, you might not like the job if you got it. There are a whole bunch of different risks that go into thinking about, should I change jobs? When you start thinking about those things and you decide, yes, I'm going to go for it, you take certain actions that you believe are going to make it more likely that A, you will get the job if it's the one you decide you want to go for, B, that you'll be able to decide is it the one you want to go for, that probably should have been A, and C, that you make it as likely as possible that the positive outcome you're hoping to achieve is achieved. And that's risk management. But it starts with understanding what you're trying to achieve. And when you are a church or a school or a sports club, your objective isn't to prevent sexual abuse. It's to teach, it's to train, it's to guide. It's a whole bunch of things that are nothing to do with preventing sexual abuse as such. Sexual abuse is one of the things that can affect the outcome or the achievement of the objectives you ultimately want to achieve. whether it's for an individual minor and vulnerable adult who is abused, or that your reputation becomes so badly damaged that minors and vulnerable adults aren't available for you to guide, train, or coach in the future. And so understanding why you take the risk of working with minors and vulnerable adults at all is a key first step to understanding the story that is subsequently going to play out about here's why we exist and why we are here to do good things. Here are the risks that we face as a consequence of taking on that objective. And then stage 2, it's the customization stage of risk management best practices. This is how we are going, future tense, to protect minors and vulnerable adults from sexual abuse. This is what we're going to do. And the third stage, the actual management, this is us actually doing everything we said we were going to do in the customization. Oh, and by the way, it's also making sure that the assessment, where they're vulnerable and how we're going to protect them, remain in sync with each other, because the way they are vulnerable might change. The way you can protect will change. Lots of other stuff can also change. So you need to keep those two elements in sync with each other so that your protection remains effective. There are other things you'll also need to do, and what I'm going to talk about in a minute is what those other things are. But that's the broad outline of the story you're looking to tell, because if you can tell that story, not only will you protect minors and vulnerable adults much more effectively, because you'll have identified where they're vulnerable, you'll have identified what you need to do to keep them safe, and you will have done those things. And because you've brought those three things together, you will be much more likely to be able to protect yourselves from the consequences of failing to prevent sexual abuse. Let's look at that story in a bit more detail. Yes, sorry, this is us helping and conscientiously protecting children. First of all, let's look at the statement of intent. A safe environment is nothing more than a statement of intent that we're going to do these things and keep a safe environment. It doesn't go into any of the details about how you're actually going to achieve that, and there's nothing systematic that makes sure that those things are actually developed and delivered consistently over the long term. And you might say this looks like a fairly unfair comparison because it's such a tiny little blob on the left-hand side of clearly a longer timeline. I don't think it is, unfortunately. I wish it was unfair. But given the level of controls that are not included in a safe environment, and given the processes that are not included in a safe environment, this is actually a slightly more conservative comparison than I could have realistically made. And you'll see why, I think, in a minute. The actual setup is, first of all, to start by understanding the nature of your organisation as a first, because you need to understand your organisation to make sure that when it changes, to the extent that that changes how minors and vulnerable adults are potentially vulnerable to sexual abuse, or how you need to protect them, those two also might change, so you need to understand your organisation first. And the key part of understanding your organisation is the other aspect, which is so different between a safe environment and risk management best practice, and that's the issue of engagement. None of us like thinking or talking about sexual abuse. We avoid it like the plague if we possibly can. A safe environment, by saying follow these three controls and kids will be safe, enables us to not think about sexual abuse. And if we're not thinking about sexual abuse, like we weren't thinking about how we're going to make sure that if we move from one job to another, we make it as likely as possible that we get a positive outcome from it, you're not going to manage the situation well. You're going to end up in a job that you didn't want, or you're going to be stuck where you were, and you won't move on if you don't think about how to move from A to B. It's no different to any other risk, and it's certainly no different from sexual abuse. And one of the core problems with a safe environment is that it enables organisations and people in them to not have to think about sexual abuse because that's what they want to do. They don't want to think about it. It's a cognitive bias. We're not necessarily consciously aware of it. We just know we don't like talking about sexual abuse. This first stage enables that engagement because now we're thinking about sexual abuse in the context of what our organisation is trying to achieve. So that's where we start. Then we put the customization phase in place. This is stage 2 of risk management. Assess is stage 1, customize is stage 2. And in stage 2, what you're doing is figuring out which controls are going to prevent sexual abuse and which ones broadly, this is very broadly speaking. First is how do you prevent it? And secondly, how do you identify it as early as possible if you can't prevent it? And that's broadly speaking what the control phase of the customization is all about. And it's looking at where you've already identified minors and vulnerable adults are potentially vulnerable to sexual abuse. You have a list of the top 10 places where they're potentially vulnerable, and you identify what you need to do to prevent and identify in those contexts. So that's the customization, the first half of the customization phase. The second half is to think about the processes that need to be in place to make sure that once you've put those controls in place, that they actually happen, and that you record that they have happened, and that you identify that they are happening in the way you intended them to happen. In other words, they're achieving the results that you want them to achieve, and that you can monitor that they don't need adapting because, for example, you identify better ways to do things, or you identify that there are better practices that could be implemented, all sorts of different things that could make a difference. Your organisation could change and you may need to adapt to that. Those are the monitoring systems that you need to put in place. And that's the first, and in the customization stage, what you're doing is designing the basic plans and implementing the basic plans to make sure that you maintain the assessment. Where are the vulnerabilities and risks, and what are the controls and processes to deal with them? How do you keep those in sync? And you then move into the management phase where you maintain the system, where you're monitoring those prevention controls, making sure that they're actually happening, and you're performing the protection activities and processes. And prevention is preventing sexual abuse, and protection is protecting yourselves by performing those processes. You've also, or will have created as part of the customization, a way of, first of all, responding to various types of incident. I'm not going to go into all the details of what all those incidents are now, but there are, broadly speaking, 3 different types, and a catch-all for everything that wasn't in one of the first 3 categories. And you're also going to need to manage change. Some change you will identify ahead of time. You might decide, for example, that you're going to use a new facility, and you'll need to check whether it has the physical requirements that you need, and if it doesn't, how you're going to accommodate its deficiencies, for example. In terms of incident, you will also need to make sure that you, if you don't plan for change, but change happens, that you have a way of identifying it. So both incident responses and change need to be planned for, and then you need to record, first of all, that you had an incident, in terms of incident response. An incident took place. What happened? Did you follow your plan? If you did follow your plan, record that you did that. If you decided not to follow your plan, which is perfectly reasonable, and you might find that the plan wasn't appropriately set up, and that's fine, you adapt. But if you don't follow the plan that you said you were going to follow, you need to record why you didn't do it. And it doesn't take long to think this through, but if you've said, for example, that if somebody behaves in a certain way, that some form of sanction needs to be in place. So you have a behavior requirement, and somebody doesn't observe that requirement. And if you say you're going to do X when that happens, if you've identified that a person has not met that requirement and you decided not to implement that sanction, you need to have a really clear record of why that was the case. Otherwise, you've got a smoking gun, because a plaintiff's attorney is going to turn around, particularly if that person turns out to be an abuser. So you decided not to take this action when this clear evidence of abuse happened. Why was that exactly? So it's really important that you have to have an incident response plan, otherwise you take everything on an ad hoc basis, and that just doesn't work. If you have a plan, though, you have to follow it, or you have to record why you didn't follow it. Same with change. What you're looking at is, here's a change that we think we might need to adapt to. Yes or no? If yes, how are we going to adapt to it, and who's going to deal with it? So that 3 years later, when somebody who's taken over this job decides that they need to understand why we're doing this, there's a record of why that change was made. What you're also going to do formally is, at least once a year, make sure that your assessment and customization remain in sync with each other. You'll partly be doing it all the time through the various maintenance methods that we'll talk about in more detail later, but you also need to just make sure that there is a formal mechanism for verifying that your assessment and customization remain in sync. And then lastly, you need to continuously improve your system. Sexual abuse is still rising until we can, whether we can ever prevent it altogether, I think is questionable. It's our belief that you cannot prevent sexual abuse for all sorts of reasons. Abusers are extremely devious, children don't understand what sexual abuse is, and candidly anybody's capable of making a stupid decision. So I think it's going to be very difficult to absolutely prevent sexual abuse completely. We don't believe it's possible, and we actually think it's dangerous to even think that you can. But you can constantly or continuously try to improve so that you make it as unlikely as possible that sexual abuse is going to happen. That's what we're all trying to achieve, and you only achieve that with continuous improvement. So what does all this mean, and why does this story matter? The assessment stage establishes child protection and how you're going to keep kids safe. The management phase maintains the child protection that you've put in place, and it does all the things that you need to do to make sure that what you established actually works. And then by recording it all, both the establishment and the maintenance of child protection, and recording it all the different activities and explaining why you did this and when that happened and who did what to when, you protect your organisation. Because by having a by having a detailed record of everything that you've done and that it's based on what you said you were going to do, this is why trust is such an important part of sexual abuse risk management. We said we were going to do this, and we did it, and we conscientiously protected children. And here is the story that tells the story of, here is the timeline that tells the story of our conscientiously protecting minors and vulnerable adults from sexual abuse. So that's, broadly speaking, what we're going to talk about in this video. Further videos in this series will talk about specifically why BOCRIM takes the second part of breaking the cycle, because breaking the cycle is one thing. Bringing this kind of system in place and making sure that everybody's using risk management best practice is one thing. The elephant in the room about the safe environment is that it wasn't designed to adapt fast enough to keep up with the pace of change in sexual abuse and risk management. And what needs to be in place is not only this system that enables organisations to manage sexual abuse risk as well as possible, but what enables that continuous improvement that ensures that the cycle that we're currently trapped in of ever-rising sexual abuse and ever-rising sexual abuse risk costs does not and cannot reassert itself once we've broken it. Because the worst thing would be that we figure out a new system that everybody starts using, and in 10 years' time we're back to square one because we didn't keep adapting it and moving it forward and constantly improving it. And that's the second element of what BOCRIM, and that's where BOCRIM takes things to a step further. We help organisations move through the process of putting all of this in place. We also help that continuous improvement that ensures that the practice of child protection keeps moving forward, doesn't stagnate again, and so that cycle does not reassert itself. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's been informative. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to watch more, please subscribe. Thank you very much.